From Public Radio International, I'm Jacki Lyden, and this is America Abroad.
And I'm Yusuf Mansur with Jordan Media Institute.
Today, our teams have joined forces for Jordan on the Frontline, an international town hall. We've brought together two live audiences, one here in the U.S. at the studios of WHYY in Philadelphia, and the other in Amman, Jordan, their capital city. So we want to say hello, Philly, and mahaba, Amman.
We're live streaming this event on the web. Join the online conversation via Twitter, if you're on Twitter. And we're using the hashtag AAM Town Hall. We hope to hear from you during the broadcast as you watch this program.
Before we begin, let's take a moment to place Jordan on a map because Jordan's location has everything to do with our conversation today. Jordan sits right at the center of the Middle East. That's really not an exaggeration. To the southeast is Saudi Arabia. Jordan has very important neighbors. To the northeast is Iraq, where fighting and unrest have been flaring on and off, as we know, since 2003. Israel and the Palestinian territories lie to the west, and Syria is to the north. And this does place Jordan on the front line of the Syrian war and in the crosshairs of the international fight against the rising Islamic State. Yet for all the conflict in the region, and I've lived there, Jordan itself has remained relatively stable. This central and moderate state has been one of America's key Arab allies in the Middle East for many, many years.
This is true, Jacki, and our stability has made our country a haven for refugees. In fact, this has been going on for many decades now. The number of non-Jordanians in the country right now makes about 40% of the population.
The population of Jordan stands at about 6.5 million right now, and a full 10% of that population is made up of refugees coming in from Syria, about 650,000 people just in the last few years since 2011. There's hundreds, even thousands of refugees that cross the border every month. This puts a lot of pressure on our very limited resources. It makes for tough times in the country, and it's just one of the issues that we'll be talking about today, this stress on the population and the overall environment. So let's start with a quick introduction of our panelists, and we're going to go to Jordan first. So, Yusuf, would you please introduce your guests?
Thank you, Jacki. Here in Amman, we have Andrew Harper of the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR. He's been at the front line of the refugee issue, and he will be discussing the impact of the Syrian refugees on the Jordanian people, economy, and the overall environment, and the kind of pressure it's putting on the Jordanian people.
So perhaps we'd like to ask Andrew how this compares to other conflicts and what that pressure looks and feels like for an agency like UNHCR's refugee agency in Jordan. Andrew?
Okay. Well, firstly, thank you for having us on today. And I think it's particularly important given the US's very close relationship with Jordan. And I must add, if it wasn't for the US, we'd be in a much more difficult position. As Yusuf mentioned at the start, the Syrian influx is just one of many influxes that Jordan has absorbed over the last, basically since Jordan's inception. We've had Palestinians coming across the border, we've had Iraqis, we've had Syrians, and now we're also being confronted with another influx of Iraqis. So it's not only that Jordan's on the front line at the moment, Jordan has always been on the front line. And when we look at support to Jordan, we cannot look at just an emergency support. Everyone has seen the refugee camps established in Jordan. But what we need to do is ensure that we not only protect the refugees who have been so generously hosted in Jordan, but we also ensure that Jordan's tradition of generosity is not taken for granted. And in many aspects, this is taken for granted. We cannot undermine the generosity, the rich traditions of protecting those people in need. Because if you look at the region, there's very few other areas which people can flee to. And so what we need to do is to even reinforce the ability, the confidence of a country like Jordan to continue to be able to absorb refugees until those refugees can go home. Because that's the ultimate objective, that until such time that peace can take place in Syria, which is not evident at the moment, that Jordan is fully supported, and not just in refugee camps, but in the towns, for as long as possible.
Thank you, Andrew. We also have Dr. Muhammad Abu Rumman. He's a political analyst and writer. In 30 seconds, can you tell us the impact of the Syrian refugee crisis on the politics and society in Jordan?
In 30 seconds, I think
30
that
minutes, 30 hours, no, 30 seconds.
As you mentioned, and gentlemen here, that I think it's a huge and big challenge to Jordanian politics. It's one of the most important issues that Jordan suffered now from. It's not something that you can jump on these days. The refugees to Jordanians now, they put the pressures on the economy. Of course, you are economists and you mentioned many issues here, but on the politics also and in the security level, you talk about borders. It's not stable. We don't talk about stable borders. We talk about insecure countries around us. You talk about hundreds of thousands of refugees coming here. You don't have a database about most of them. So that I think we can talk about many dimensions when we talk about the refugees, to what they mean to Jordan these days.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Jacki, who do you have there in Philadelphia?
Yusuf, joining me here on stage is Faisal Itani. Faisal is a resident fellow with the Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Faisal, you in fact are from Lebanon. I think you hail from Beirut. Of course, Lebanon is Syria's close neighbor. That's a whole other relationship. And obviously, the refugee crisis is not happening in a vacuum. I mean, refugees don't become refugees unless there is trouble. And this is a direct result of the war in Syria, which isn't expected to end anytime soon. Could you, I know this is a tough one, provide some context for us? Can the international community make any progress in Jordan while the war rages on?
Limited progress. I think as long as there is robust financial support for the Jordanian state, but I think more importantly, as long as there's a situation within the Syrian war in which the southern theater of the war is somewhat less toxic than other areas of the country where jihadist groups have been able to take root and establish institutions. I think the geography of the Syrian war is actually really the critical thing. And I think the Jordanians recognize that. But you know, the situation in the south could well change, and jihadis may actually gain the upper hand there. ISIS is already trying to move into that area. So no, I think watching the war in Syria and its trajectory is probably the single most important long-term factor.
And by geography, you're talking about proximity, and we are going to address some of the problems with the Syrian war and strategy before the end of this program. We're just not going to do it all right now. And obviously, it's going on now for 3 years and has displaced hundreds of thousands of people. So thank you so much, Faisal. And I also have here Sean Yam. Sean Yam is a professor at Temple University, and his work focuses on Middle East politics. Welcome, Sean. What would you say, Sean, I can almost see you, is the United States' top priority with regard to Syria and Jordan right now?
I would say America's top priority in Washington is to make sure Syria is controllable in terms of the externalities of that civil war, making sure that refugee flows don't inundate the border, making sure that the externalities of jihadist activity don't don't flow over to Jordan and endanger its security. And I would say America's priority with Jordan is what it's always been since the U.S. has been involved in Jordan's foreign policy since the 1950s, which is ensure the survival of the regime, ensure the political stability of this kingdom, and make sure that that Jordan's borders remain secure and viable.
Thank you, Sean. And again, I welcome everyone here in Philadelphia, there in Jordan. And I think we would like to dive right in now and include our audiences, all of you. I know that everyone is eager to hear what we have to say, what each other has to say. And Yusuf, I understand that in your audience, you have a number of members in the audience who live in Erbil, a city about an hour and a half north of Amman, very close to the Syrian border. We just heard about the importance of the border. And also some refugees who live in camps in that area. We'd love to hear from them what life is like there and how people's daily routines have been affected and perhaps why they left and when.
Yes, we do. Who shall we start with first? We have Ala Hamdan. She is a journalist who works with refugees. Ala, would you like?
Hello, my name is Ala Hamdan. This topic is actually huge when you think about it. You don't know where do you want to start. But I've volunteered a little bit with refugees at the Zatar refugee camp, which is the first camp that officially opened for refugees. And I mostly worked with women and children, and just seeing the children that some of them have lost 2 or 3 years of education, seeing women not able to give proper housing or even raising their children properly as they used to in Syria, just shows you how much troubled a whole generation might be resulted out of refugee camps. To add to that, most of the refugees at the Zatar refugee camp are children. Maybe Mr. Andrew can correct me with that. Most of them, 50%, are under the age of 18. So we're looking at a refugee of children where not asked as mandatory to go to schools, and not living in a very healthy atmosphere as they used in Syria before the war. So I'm not an expert about everything, of course, at the refugee, but mostly women and children, and I see that Jordan is facing a huge challenge by having all these. Okay, so I think with having all these refugees, we can say Jordan has one of the biggest refugee camps in the world for Syrians. It's the 4th, I think, or 5th biggest city in Jordan now. So it's mostly for refugees. I don't know how Mr. Andrew handles that every single day, going to the camp and seeing all this. But I know things have improved. I've been there since it opened 2012, and I've been there a few weeks ago. And I know it's becoming better, but how good can a camp be for refugees? So I'm excited to hear more thoughts and ideas from my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ala. Thank you. And Andrew, would you like to say something?
No, I think what Alice just said was perfect. We're at risk of losing a generation of Syrian children, and if we don't provide them with a future, if we don't provide them with hope, what happens to them? So we need to invest in the education. We need to invest in ensuring that they have a positive outlook so that they don't be going into negative coping mechanisms, which we describe as potentially illegal working or being forced to go back to Syria. But we should also pay thanks to Jordan's Ministry of Education, because many of the schools in Jordan have had to accept hundreds of more Syrian children, and that's put strain on everything from teachers having to work longer hours, to books having to be shared more, to even the schools being sort of having to be repaired or rehabilitated more. So, but it has to be something which the international community takes more responsibility for. We need to have many more schools being built, because the investment now will pay dividends in the future.
And we'll ask you about that. Jacki, let's hear more from your audience there in Philadelphia.
Well, I'd like to take questions from our audience, but I think, if you don't mind, I'll begin with another member of the audience who is a Jordanian journalist. Salameh Namat is joining us today. And I know you've been looking at this situation closely. Can you talk a little bit about the pressures that the kingdom is undergoing right now? Salameh, you'd have to stand up at that mic. And then we'd love to invite more questions from all of you and talk about what is happening to education and living conditions and other pressures.
Well, clearly, Jordan is having to deal with a number of challenges. Some are economic, some are political in nature, and some are security challenges. And we need to keep in mind that Jordan was the fourth poorest country in water resources. Now it has dropped to the third rank, the third poorest country. It could end up in a year or two as the poorest country in water resources. And this is very dangerous from not only socio-political and economic, but also security perspective. It's a challenge that Jordan, we don't know how it's going to deal with, especially with the country running out of its reserve of water, most lately from the DC project in the south. With no major project to produce new water resources, let's say from water desalination, from the seawater desalination, I think Jordan is in real trouble in a matter of a few years. Now, this is one of the reasons is, Jordan was always poor in water resources, but with nearly 1 million extra people moving into the country, something close to 10% of the population, I think that the problem is likely to exacerbate. Naturally, apart from the economic impact that we all know, this humanitarian crisis has also exacerbated unemployment, the unemployment problem in Jordan. It has increased the security burden on the Jordanian security establishment because of having to monitor not only now the Jordanian-Syrian borders, but also the Jordanian-Iraqi borders. With the rise of the Islamic State and basically both Iraq and Syria nearing status of a failed state, Jordan is having problems coordinating with the other side, which doesn't exist in most of the time. So these challenges are massive, and one does have to recognize that had it not been for regional powers and countries like the United States and Europe basically extending that serious, fundamentally critical help to the kingdom, I don't think it would have been able to host this number of refugees and deal with this multi-dimensional crisis.
Okay, thank you so much. I'd just like to remind our audience that a refugee crisis is a holistic one, and Jordan is dealing with the largest refugee crisis since World War II. Faisal, I'd like to ask you about how that translates into political pressures, into that kind of sense of security in Jordan.
I think there's the short-term outlook and the long-term one. I think in the short term, I would say the most proximate threat is, firstly, the economic pressures on the finances of the state, but also any potential sort of social friction between refugees and the local population.
But if I could just interrupt a moment, Jordan has dealt with refugees for so many years, so how does this crisis differ from, say, the Iraqi influx of the 2003 and on, and other earlier ones? What's different about this one?
I'm not an expert on the Iraqi one, but as I understood from what I know of the Iraqi presence, the demographic was a bit different, and the social, economic elements that came into Jordan were a bit different, and their relationship and interaction with the Jordanian state and civilians was different. This is an overwhelmingly impoverished and large, and I think critically very long-term problem. I don't see anything on the horizon that would allow these people to return. And even if the war ended tomorrow, there's not much to go back to in many of these areas. So I think it's the timeline and the nature of the presence.
So we're talking about a very long-term population. Yusuf, maybe one of your guests, unless we have a question here, could address the economic impact that this is having on everything from the schools, an education system, to competition for housing, and things like that in the kingdom.
Andrew, would you like to address that?
Well,
the economic impact of the refugees is having on housing, work, employment?
Well, I think Yusuf is probably the best qualified for that. But what I think we've got to look at is one is that Jordan, even before the crisis, had a deficiency in regards to the numbers of hospitals and schools and infrastructure, because unlike many other countries in the Middle East, it's not a wealthy nation in regards to natural resources. It's wealthy in regards to generosity, but it's had to rely on trade with Iraq, which is now stopped, trade with Syria, which is now stopped, and in addition, having hundreds of thousands of more Syrians. So this has had an impact on every element. That one, the economy has suffered from the lack of trade, but also there's been increasing competition for work, increasing competition for accommodation, which has driven up prices. The international community has provided a significant amount of support, and that probably needs to be calculated to see what the net benefit versus the cost. But there's no doubt, given the pressure on Jordan's already fairly vulnerable economy, on top of the fact that the refugees are putting an immense amount of pressure on the water, electricity, and overall infrastructure. So the costs are difficult to estimate, but it's got to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Andrew, with about 30,000 children born to the refugees in the last couple of years, what's being done to accommodate these refugees in the long term? What's the policy stance on this?
Well, it's a good point, because the refugee population is not static. It's a population that grows, and the Syrian population is growing by 15,000 just births every year. So we'd be looking at another 15,000 in 2015 at least. So this population needs to be looked after. The mothers have to go to hospital, the children have to be looked after, and they will be going to school. And so what we need to ensure that they go to school, but eventually they have a future which is not necessarily in a refugee camp. Ideally, every refugee wishes to go back home. No one wants to live in a refugee camp. And the international community needs to be doing much more in trying to find a political solution, and not leaving it to the countries surrounding Syria to basically take the negative impact of what is really an international disaster.
Okay. Back to you, Jacki.
All of these challenges, the long-term unemployment, the poverty, the competition for already limited resources, as we've been hearing, are the kinds of problems, I can say as a erstwhile Middle East correspondent, that can fester and lead to radicalism. And I'd like to ask Sean, what humanitarian aid or other kinds of holistic aid is needed to temper radicalism within Jordan's borders?
Jacki, that's a very good question. And it's difficult to connect, in my mind, issues of purely humanitarian assistance with issues of ideological extremism or of militancy, because oftentimes humanitarian aid isn't used properly, and material conditions are also not the only determinant of ideological extremism or of the evolution of some groups which may locate themselves as self-styled radical or militant groups now, and it doesn't necessarily determine how far or how more conservative they get. But in terms of moderating or attempting to ameliorate the kind of poor material conditions that we often see in many refugee-stricken areas, including the Za'atari refugee camp, which to my count is now the third largest city in Jordan after Amman and Irbil, it would require providing Jordan with all of the basic consumables and fungible funds Jordan needs to provide a basic standard of living for the refugees. It should be noted that the refugee crisis, about the macroeconomic impact, this refugee crisis is far more serious in my mind than the Iraqi refugee crisis. The modal Iraqi refugee household during that crisis between 2005 and 2008 was generally a middle-class household with some mobile capital, some spending money, and some set of viable skills. And their return to Iraq was contingent upon the restoration of legal order and of basic security. Now, in the Syrian case, the modal refugee is not necessarily a skilled middle-class refugee families, not necessarily a skilled middle-class household. Many of the refugees, as Faisal has mentioned, are semi-skilled or unskilled, and they were driven from Syria by conditions of war which require a lot more than the simple restoration of public order. The Iraqi refugees were fleeing the breakdown of order by a post-war transition government. The Syrian refugees are fleeing from the collapse of a state. And their return to Syria, if there is a return, is contingent upon the recreation of some viable state enterprise there, some viable state project that can provide security and services. But the only real contender that we see in Syria that still could possibly do that in the near future would be the very regime that caused this problem in the first place, which is the Assad regime. And so all of the economic costs that are affiliated, that are associated with the refugee burden, the increase of demand in housing, the infrastructural costs, the demand on water, which Mr. Ni'amat mentioned is extremely serious, and I agree. Jordan has less water than oil, and Jordan has no oil. Right? So it's an extremely dire situation. The taxing burden this places on schools, all of these basic consumables and infrastructural needs that the refugees require have a far longer term horizon than Iraq. So any kind of humanitarian assistance to Jordan has to be done on at least a moderate to long-term basis. It can't be done on a yearly basis where it's assumed that next year conditions will improve in Syria and everyone's going to go back, because that's clearly not the case.
Faisal, before we take a break, do you just want to add a comment about what might be done in these kinds of situations? We have seen all sorts of strife and sectarianism appear throughout the region. What might be done to temper or even prevent radicalism in this kind of inopportune economic climate?
You know, in some ways, I think the Jordanians got a bit lucky because the sort of structure and fabric of their population is a bit different than in Iraq and Syria, where this radicalization, to call it in the abstract, took a particularly violent, pernicious form, in the form ultimately of something like ISIS. That required an environment of really deep sectarian hostility and mistrust. And that's really, really central to the way this played out. Jordan doesn't have that issue to begin with. And I think, therefore, it might find itself struggling with some sort of Salafi militancy, as it already has to a certain manageable degree. But for it to be facing that sort of threat in that sort of form, it would take a lot more to get there. And of course, you know, there are other secondary things. You know, to what extent operationally can radical groups operate in these environments, and how does the regime deal with the population, including the refugee population? I mean, ultimately, it will do what it has to do to protect itself, but also, you know, character, attitudes, and temperament of the regime matter. It's not the Syrian regime, it's not even the Iraqi one. And so far, it's been a bit more subtle and benign in its handling of the population.
Well, and we'll just remind the audience that it has been a monarchy since its inception and continues to be with, of course, a parliament. And King Hussein was the longest ruling monarch, and now, of course, his son Abdullah. All right, we're going to take a short break. Thank you very, very much to all our guests, both here and in Jordan. When we come back, we are going to talk about the rise of the Islamic State around Jordan and its impact on the country. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back to Jordan on the Frontline, an international town hall from America Abroad and the Jordan Media Institute. I'm your co-host, Jacki Lyden, and I'm joined by a live audience here in Philadelphia and one in Amman, Jordan. Our host there is Yusuf Mansur. Hello to everyone, or mahaba. To pick up the conversation now to talk about the rise of the Islamic State in the region, also known as ISIS or ISIL. There's a lot of confusion actually about the name. Yusuf, what is the organization referred to, if I can call it an organization, referred to there? What do you call it?
We in Jordan refer to ISIS as Daesh, which is an Arabic acronym for ISIS. My guest here, political analyst Dr. Muhammad Abu Rumman, is an expert on these extremist groups, and I would like for him to tell us a little bit about their impact on the political life in Jordan and Jordanians.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yusuf. We distinguish here between two levels. The first level, it is the regional level. When we talk about the raising of ISIS in Iraq and Syria and the impact on Jordan, of course, we here talk about the Jordanian national security, about the Jordanian participation in the military campaign against this organization in Iraq and Syria. I don't think that it has a strong or deep impact in our political life from the regional level. We, as I understand the guest here in there, as he mentioned that we don't have the same circumstances like what is happening in Iraq and Syria. Also, we don't have, for example, a sectarian struggle in Jordan between Shia and Sunni, so that I don't think that they propose or they schedule to come to Jordan from the region. Maybe they plan to do some works in Jordan, but until now, the Jordanian intelligence, they discovered some of the groups which they related to ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But what is more important, in my opinion, it is the internal situation, that the radicalization inside Jordan, that we have this group become bigger and bigger last years, influenced by what's happening in the region, in Iraq and in Syria. We talk about now 2,000 Jordanians. They are fighting with Jabhat al-Nusra and with ISIS in Iraq and Syria. They crossed the borders, or they went through the Turkish borders to join these groups there. Also, we have people here, hundreds of people. Now, if you look to the Jordanian newspaper, every day.
Dr. Muhammad, why do you think they're being radicalized? 2,000 is a good number.
Yeah, it's a huge number, and which shocked us here in Jordan. And I'm, as a specialist, I didn't expect that will happen in Jordan in this short period. If you return back to before 80 years, for example, we were talking about 2,000 until 3,000 people. They related, the supporters of Al-Qaeda or the radical groups. Now we talk about thousands. Of course, the regional situation affected in Jordan. Many people feel sympathy with the Syrians, with Iraqis, feel that they suffering from a huge struggle, a dramatic struggle. And when they look to the situation there, they try to help them. And this is one of. Second, I think there is an economic, social condition in Jordan. Internal issues here also affected on many people. When you talk also about the people, about the political reform, it's not a strong process here in Jordan which convince people, especially the youth or the youngs, that they will find their hopes and they will find themselves in the political process or in the public sphere, so that they look to outside to try to figure out the question of identity. So that it's complicated. We can't talk about simple reasons, but there are regional reasons and internal reasons combined with each other to create this raising. And it's, by the way, it's not only in Jordan. If you look to the all of the region, I think the radicalization is spreading all over the region these days.
Thank you, Dr. Muhammad. Back to you, Jacki.
Faisal and Sean, maybe you could respond to that. I was particularly struck by what was said about surprising even Dr. Abu Rahman, the short period of time. He said, I would not have expected a couple of thousand people in a relatively short period of time. We're talking about the kingdom's stability in the last segment, and now we're talking about radicalization.
Well, I'll lead off with just two very brief comments. First, to Dr. Abu Rahman, as an aside, it's really nice to meet you, albeit virtually. So it's a pleasure to actually put a face on the author I've been reading so much of. So Thank you for joining us. Number two, I think it is worrisome that 2,000 to 3,000 Jordanians have reportedly left to go fight with ISIS. But when I look at the radicalization sort of scenario in Jordan, what surprises me the most is not how radicalized it is, but how little it's radicalized compared to what it could have been. I mean, if you look at the numbers across the region, Tunisia has sent 3,000 people to fight in, to fight for Daesh, right? It's 1,500 miles from Tunis to Damascus, and that's if there was a direct flight. In the early days in Jordan, you could catch a bus or a train to the border and join, and clearly not many people did that. 1,500 have come from Saudi Arabia, over 1,000 alone from the UK plus France. We know several hundred from the US. The fact that Jordan borders Syria, it is obviously not a fully democratic state. It's a very stable authoritarian regime. Things have not been great there financially or economically. There is still lingering poverty in many parts of the country. And we're told that things are never fully secure or stable there. The fact that only 2,000 right, have crossed the border and fought for Daesh, I think suggests that, as Dr. Abu Ruman said, there's, the level of radicalization is worrisome, but it could be a lot more, and it's not. And that's a key reality I think we need to remember when tempering our projections about how extreme the situation in Jordan has become.
Thank you, Sean. Faisal?
Yeah, no, I just want to add a modifier here about the sort of movement of these Islamist militants into Syria. I don't have access to the Interior Ministry's database or anything, but all data indicates that most of these fighters go to join Jabhat al-Nusra, not ISIS. And that's different.
So you're talking now about in central Iraq, you're talking about even into
No, I'm talking about in Syria.
In Syria.
The ones who
All
moved
right.
from Jordan to Syria. And this is different. They're not necessarily ideologically better, but the motivations are different. And the criteria for who you join in Syria is very complicated. Jabhat al-Nusra is an insurgent group that primarily fights the Syrian regime.
Right.
So out of sympathy...
Inside Syria.
Inside Syria. So out of sympathy for the uprising, because they're an effective group, well-resourced and disciplined, many persons who want to gravitate toward the conflict go there. And that's because they identify with that particular struggle. ISIS is something a bit more universalist, and its treatment of the local populations has alienated quite a few people, even outside Syria. So they're going to join an insurgency in the context of a very brutal conflict, even if they're joining a very disturbing group, is a different thing than everybody suddenly becoming a hardcore ideologue who wants to overthrow the Jordanian monarchy tomorrow. Maybe this is something, in the abstract and the ideology, it's part of the agenda. But, we need to focus on really what it is that fighters choose when they go to join an insurgency. And it's not just, as simple as I've decided this is the way I see the world and I'm going to go and join.
I think that's an excellent point, because from our perspective, things can look so homogenous when in fact they're extremely complicated and nuanced. Halime, you're a citizen, you have lived there. Could you, and I'd like to encourage anyone who has a question about ISIS, either in Jordan or in the region, to ask questions. This is a community town hall. Could you talk about what you've seen in terms of radicalization within the kingdom, and maybe just some observations or some pressure points?
Thank you. Yes, well, basically, the population of Jordan, just like the population in the region, are witnessing daily scenes of carnage on their TV screens, something that very little actually is seen in the United States. It's a daily dose of images of bombardment by the Syrian regime forces of civilian populations, babies being pulled out from underneath the rubble, women, men, kids, dying by the dozens on a daily basis. And this is basically transformed immediately into people's living rooms. So these forces of radicalization can only increase with time. And I think every time there's an innocent civilian who is killed, somebody's going to be radicalized. And this is the recruitment tool for the jihadists in general, whether it's Jabhat al-Nusra or ISIS, etc. But I think to look at the macro picture and where did ISIS come from? I mean, we did have Al-Qaeda before it was strategically defeated in Iraq, if we may say so. ISIS is something that came to the scene just in recent months, in a year ago, a year and a half ago at maximum. And I think that we should really understand where did this come from in order to be able to tackle the root cause of the problem rather than the phenomena, which is, in my view, ISIS or the Islamic State is the product of years of mismanagement of Iraq, the rule of the Maliki government, the pro-Iran Shiite-dominated government that has marginalized a lot of the Sunni population, especially in western Iraq, and the military campaign that has been taking place, by the Maliki government in the Anbar province, which made all Sunni Muslims feel targeted by an Iran proxy, being Maliki being, allied with Iran. And then the Arab uprisings came in 2011, and it created an opportunity for people to mobilize. And then we saw how the Syrian regime reacted against Syrian regime here, also part of the pro-Iran axis in the region together with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And we saw how it clamped down on, violently against the peaceful protesters, which radicalized the whole Syrian rebel movement. And then contributed so on the one hand, pro-Iran Iraqi government is literally marginalizing and killing Sunnis, purging Sunnis in Iraq. And then Bashar al-Assad, his ally on the other side, is doing the same with the Sunni population that opposes him, predominantly Sunni population that's opposing him. So add to that the Hezbollah factor, again, another proxy of Iran, controlling, Lebanon, preventing it from having this, functioning government, preventing it from having a functioning president. Then the overall picture is years of pro-Iran axis clamping down on Sunnis, and most violently, of course, by the Assad regime, as we've seen over the last 3 years, produced this counter basic lashback, radical Sunni jihadist movement. You can call it Islamic State, you can call it Jabhat, you can call it anything. These are extremists who are reacting to an extremist action by pro-Iran forces. So if we're going to solve this problem, we cannot just deal with the the repercussions and the outcome of the crisis and its manifestations. We really have to go to the root causes, and this is to stop the Iraqi government from doing, marginalizing Sunnis, and to stop these military campaigns, and to stop Bashar al-Assad forces from killing the civilian population.
Okay, thank you so much, Salameh. Yusuf, let's go back to Amman and ask you. I wonder if you or Dr. Abu Rahman might talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the U.S. approach to fighting ISIS in not only Jordan, but the region, if we can talk about that in a fairly succinct way, if possible.
Yes, Dr. Abu Rahman has been wanting to comment on what
Not very much
said right now.
But yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I totally agree, by the way, with I think Salameh. He was talking.
Yes, it was Salameh Ahmad.
Salameh Ahmad, yeah. I totally agree with him. I think the problem of the American approach or strategy until now, it's that it deals with the outputs, not with the inputs. If you are going to the American discourse, official discourse, they realized and they admitted that there are reasons, causes of the rising of ISIS. And as Salameh mentioned, we talk here about main reason. It is the Sunni crisis in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. When you go through these three societies, you talk about millions of Sunnis. They are afraid about their identity, about their existence, so that it is a huge problem. So that it's not the question of ISIS, it's the question of the reason of which built the capacity of ISIS, which built the recruitment to ISIS. This is the question. Yes. Now the American discourse, official discourse, it's admit that there are reasons, and ISIS, or the rising of ISIS, it's a result. But when you are going to the ground, what is happening now, it is only a military campaign against ISIS without having a strong also or an equal efforts to give hopes to the Sunni society, to give real solutions. In Syria, for example, now the Sunni in Syria, most of them, I was sitting with Burhan Ghalioun. He is a secular, famous one,
Yes.
and he before 4 weeks, and he will know, he used to be the head of the National Syrian Council in the opposition, and he said that if by this war, I think that most of the Syrians will turn to be ISIS, because they think that these airstrikes assist the Assad regime, not assist the Syrian opposition. So that this is a very big problem. Also in Iraq, yes, you changed the al-Maliki, you brought al-Abadi, you tried to engage the Sunni again, but until now they didn't feel that it is a real political solution because the Iranian influence in Iraq and Syria and other places. Also, Salama mentioned another important point, that you are talking about the Sunni terrorism, but what about the Shia terrorism? I don't mention Sunni or Shia, but I'm trying to give you a picture about how the other part think. We have Shia militias. They are fighting in Iraq, fighting in Syria,
They want a
fighting
balance.
Hezbollah. Qasim Soleimani is the leader of these militias. So that why you talk about this part and don't talk about the other part? This is it is this approach itself. It gives legitimacy, quotations here, to the propaganda of ISIS, not only in Syria and Iraq and other Arabic places like Jordan, Tunisia, and other countries.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Rumman. Let's go to the audience now for 2 or 3 questions. Any questions? It can be a
Yes, I
comment
actually
also.
have a comment over what we've heard, and especially in the second part, and I would like actually to connect it to what we heard in the first part. Now, I was very glad to hear about the radicalization numbers that we've heard from Dr. Abu Rumman and the analysis that we heard from the US. And the analysis that we heard from the US is really very interesting. When we say that 2,000 people going and joining ISIS is not that heavy, we want to look at 2 factors. When we look at extremism, today we are looking at religion. In history we looked at race, color. So instead of looking at the surface level of the extreme polarity, we need really to look down at the root reasons for such extremism. And we all know, and it's not new what I'm going to say, that mainly extremism comes from economic and social pressures. It's not related to race, color, or religion. Once those things are solved, then we would find a huge diminishing of such extremism. Now in Jordan, the beautiful thing that we have a very good level of education, intellectuality, and awareness levels. But we cannot avoid the fact that we do have economic and social pressures. So with those 2 forces joining together, we had the outcome of having 2,000 people today joining ISIS. But connecting now to the first part, where the refugees are making more pressure on the infrastructure and the economy and on the economic and social aspects of Jordan, we might see if those levels have increased, that will affect the intellectuality and maturity levels that we talked about, and we might see further joining and numbers might increase because of such pressures. And this is the comment that I want to say, and this is the analysis that we really need to go through and not just look at Sunni, Shia, or all the other surface areas that we are looking at. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yusuf,
take
maybe you
more
could just ask
questions
the
or comments.
gentleman for his identification. I just would be curious to know.
Would you mention your name, please?
My name is Rami Dole, and I'm a co-founder of a Facebook group called Out and About, and our purpose is to build a society based on unified values. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's take another question or comment.
أحمد لانانزا. ما هو دور الدول المتقدمة في مساعدة اللاجئين بداية؟ وثانيا، ما هو دور الدول المتقدمة والأمم المتحدة في حل هذه المشكلة. لا أقصد بالمساعدة قيم أو تأمين غطاء.
Let's address this in the third segment after we take a break. This is more relevant. You're asking about the role of developed countries in helping the refugees and the international community. So we'll take it in the third segment. Let's take somebody else.
Welcome, I'm Mohammed Al-Khamais.
Please mention your name and
I'm
organization or affiliation.
a journalist student from the Yarmouk University in Erbil. I actually live in Zarqa, not in Erbil, but I study in Erbil. Do you hear me?
I can't hear you.
I just want our American audience to know the guest is from the
Can you hear? Can you hear him, Jacki?
Yes,
Okay, fine.
I think we are going through away from the main subject, like the effective of refugees in the economical and the society of Jordan. We are not talking the main address about ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, these kind of things. Returning to the main subject, we re-socialite the refugees in Syria and some new campaigns for the Syrian. The government doesn't stop complaining about them. It's like we have a much effort. They are exhausting our economy and such like these alibis, like I say, for the government. But there's a lot of solution for our government and for the UN to resolve this problem, this huge capacity, huge, like I say, number of refugees here in Jordan. I suggest why the Jordanian government just start to build some industrial companies, factories in the refugees camps to resolve the big problem of the economy and to decrease the whole pressure in the economy, in the Jordan economy. This is one solution. There is a lot of solution. But I think the Jordanian government and the UN and the world, it's like, want to be this problem to be. And it didn't want this problem to solve, or it doesn't want the Syrian crisis to stop. For example, back to the ISIS thing, I don't think the US...
So you go back to ISIS?
And eventually I go back to ISIS, because the UN forces, or not the American forces, the airstrike in ISIS, why didn't America mention that for army, like I say, army forcing, army attacking on the ISIS, on these kind of Assad regimes, these kind of armies in the land, just about 3 months ago, 6 months ago. But the Syrian crisis and the Syrian conflict has begun from 3 years or now 4 years. Why now, or like for 6 months, the army forces, the US Army, just starting to walking and starting to have a big movement about strikes in Syria? It's a big question. I need to have a satisfying answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew, you want to comment on this, and then we'll move to Dr. Abu Rahman to comment also?
Well, on the refugee side, I don't think anyone is more interested in having the refugees return than the Jordanian government and the Jordanian people and the UN, other than the refugees themselves. So I think what everyone is doing now is waiting for the time when refugees can go. The challenge for setting up an industrial complex in a refugee camp is that you're almost acknowledging that they're going to be staying indefinitely. Also, we don't even have enough money to build schools for refugees, let alone setting up an industrial complex. So if we can find peace in Syria, then that's where the investment should be going into as well in the near future.
Thank you, Andrew. Dr. Abu Rahman, you want to comment on the ISIS part of the comment?
Yes, I want to elaborate some points. The gentleman here mentioned that the causes or the reason we talk about social economic reasons, so that we don't talk about Shia Sunni struggle. Yes, but when we talk about the Iraqi, Syrian, Lebanese case, we have to talk about the Sunni class, because it is the main reason there that which elaborate or explain why ISIS become a strong and a big organization there, and how they build their ability to recruit many or hundreds of thousands of people. Return back to also to the some of the comments. We have to also to distinguish here between when we talk about 2,000 people, not all of them were going to ISIS. Many of them were going to Al-Nusra front, for example, and our here guest in Washington, he explained the differences between Al-Nusra and ISIS, and I agree with him about what he said. But in the beginning, the conditions, it was helping people to went there, so that many of them went to Al-Nusra. There was no ISIS before, when you talk about 2011, 2012, 13. But after the problems began to appear between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, many of the Jordanians began to go to ISIS more than Jabhat al-Nusra. Now, when we talk about this group in Jordan, the new generation, they are closer to ISIS more than Jabhat al-Nusra. Few of the minority only still with Jabhat al-Nusra, but the new generation of the Salafist or radical groups in Jordan, they are closer to ISIS more than Jabhat al-Nusra. Also, when we talk about when we compare it with the Tunisian case, for example, no, I think 2,000, it's a huge. When we talk about the Jordanian population, and it's not only 2,000, it's we here talk about 2,000, they already joined these groups, but also in Jordan, there is a group which become bigger, expanding. If you look to the Jordanian newspaper, every day we have cases in the security court.
So it's a growing group.
Yes, a growing group. People try to join ISIS, people return back from ISIS. We talk about hundreds of prisoners. Already they are in the prison or arrested, and now maybe we talk later about the Jordanian law for terrorism, what the amendments happened in this law.
Thank you, Dr. Aburman. Jacki, I'm sure the comments have raised some questions with your audiences back in Philadelphia.
I certainly think so, Philadelphia. This is your moment. One need not be an expert on ISIS, Jabal al-Nusrat, or terrorism to have felt the impact in the news of the stories that we have seen coming from the region with respect to ISIS, whether it has been the unfortunate and tragic beheadings of journalists or some of the other concerns about suppression of local peoples. Reaction, comment from Philadelphians? Yes, would you step up to the microphone, please?
Hello, I'm Max Dugan. I'm a program coordinator for Al-Bustan Seeds of Culture, which is a Philadelphia-based nonprofit dedicated presenting and spreading Arab culture.
Just a little slower.
Yeah. I was just trying to get through it because it's not that interesting for everyone here. My question is to our panelists, Faisal and Sean Yom, about Professor Yom, about what are the ways, you mentioned it very briefly about kind of stemming the ideological spread of radicalization. What are those ways? Are those the more economic, political solutions that one of the audience members in Jordan spoke about? Is there some sort of ideological approach based on like a Shi'i-Sunni sort of divide? I'm just curious what you two have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Look, there's always going to be radicalism and ideologues and terrorism. But for it to resonate like this, and for them for the ideologues and the jihadists to have an argument that's difficult to push back against, you have to address the extreme situation leading to an extreme reaction. And it's sort of a glib answer, I know, not very satisfying, but the extreme situation is the situation my colleagues very accurately described in Iraq and Syria, and to a lesser extent Lebanon, but also there. As long as the other parties that are not jihadists aren't able to offer a satisfying military and political and governance answer, then these people are the ones who are going to come and give the answer. And they've had some military success. And hey, these are civil wars, and if you can win and take territory and control it, you're the one who's going to attract recruits. And to an extent, even if they don't join because they've bought the ideology wholesale, they will. They'll form their attachments. They'll be severing every other attachment they have. And even the persons who don't join may develop some ideological sympathy. But, I don't know if this is the right place to do it, but one of the gentlemen in the audience asked a question about U.S. policy. Mm-hmm. And I think he deserves an answer because it's a good question, and I sympathize with his frustration. I don't know if the answer is going to be satisfying because that's what you asked for. But look, the reason that the United States has waited 3 years and then done nothing much except bomb ISIS, look, I assure you not everybody in the United States agrees that this is the right thing to do, or everyone in Washington. But it's primarily because, to begin with, after the legacy of Iraq and Syria, President Obama wants nothing to do with getting involved in Syria, despite what you might hear. ISIS has been, unlike the other groups, explicit in its threat to the United States and its intention to attack it. America has made a very long historical investment in Iraq, and it feels partly responsible for the outcome. And of course, Iraq is an oil-rich country. Last but not least, certainly not least when it comes to this administration, addressing the issue in Syria wholesale means deciding what we're going to do about the regime. And that means jeopardizing inevitably our relationship with Iran. And since this nuclear negotiation is such a high priority of the Obama administration, that's been something they've been loath to do. So again, I'm not satisfied with those answers, but I believe that that's an accurate analysis.
All right. Thank you so very much, Faisal Intani, Shanyam, our distinguished Jordanian guests. We are going to take a very short break now, and when we come back, what the rest of the world should be doing to address the rise of the Islamic State and the refugee crisis in Jordan. Thank you. So welcome back to Jordan on the Frontline, an international town hall. I'm joined by a live audience here in Philadelphia and one in Amman, Jordan. And our co-host there is Yusuf Mansur with the Jordan Media Institute. I want to say hello to everyone. I'd like to begin this segment of the program by talking about what the rest of the world should be doing to help with the fight against the rise of the Islamic State and the ongoing refugee crisis in Jordan, what to do to assist with that. Yusuf, we'll go to you first, if you don't mind.
Okay, yes. Let's hear from Andrew Harper of the UN Refugee Agency. Your agency has reported that Jordan needs about $400 million just for next year alone.
Well, thanks, Yusuf, but that's just what UNHCR needs. I think the total agencies responding to the refugee crisis requires $1 billion. And on top of that, the Jordan government and infrastructure requires probably several billion more dollars. Actually, tomorrow we're putting out an appeal with the government of Jordan, which is requesting support for the international community to provide support. But what we're looking at now is, as been mentioned by several guests, is that we just can't be looking at this on a 6-monthly or 12-monthly basis. We need to be looking at this as for a number of years. We need to invest in it for a number of years because the refugees are going to stay here for a number of years. Yeah. And until such time that there's a political solution inside Syria and inside Iraq, the refugees are not going to be going home. So we're going to need significant international support.
How have international donors reacted in the past, and what kind of reaction do you expect for next year for this appeal?
Well, we've received about 50% of the funding that we required for this year, and so we're almost living on a day-by-day basis. So you see the pictures in the background of massive refugee camps, but what we also need to take into account is that the vast majority of refugees don't even live in the refugee camps. They're in the community. The World Food Programme was in a position that they had no money to pay for the food for the refugees as of this month. So it is really a dire situation. What we often find is that countries have money for weapons, they have money for armed interventions, but they often don't have money for refugees.
Okay. This money is needed just for the refugees and for the direct impact.
Well, we're looking at both ways for this appeal for tomorrow. We're looking at an appeal for responding to the refugees, but also supporting the host communities like the municipalities at Irbid. who, just this city of Erbil has about 240,000 Syrian refugees. It's just such an enormous pressure on everyone. And it's worth noting that this year, the world has had more refugees than it's ever had before. This is not a great indicator to have when the world is also saying that it doesn't have money to provide support to refugees.
Jordan has requested in the past about $4 billion for support in helping out with the refugees.
Yeah.
Jacki, let's go back to you and hear what your audience thinks that the U.S. role should be in this crisis.
Thank you, Yusuf. Yes, we would like to do that. So may I have your name, please, and your question here in Philadelphia?
My name is Bob Groves. I'm an interested citizen. The most basic need seems to be for the refugees to be able to return to Syria. So my question is, if the U.S. and the West could reach a nuclear deal with Iran, would that somehow enable Iran to use its influence to rid the world of the Assad regime? And if not, what other scenario is there to rid the world of the Assad regime so the refugees can return?
Big and serious question. Faisal and Sean, would you like to tackle that?
I don't mind.
That's a really great question. And I'm sure that policy has been debated or considered by some in the Obama administration. Whether or not it's realistic, I don't know. For scholars like myself, the most important thing to consider when evaluating the potential of a refugee return is not the kind of regime that's in power in Damascus. It could be run by Assad. It could be run by some other ruler, leadership, incumbent Republican, autocratic, Republican autocrat or whatnot. The most important thing is there a stable state in place? No matter what regime rules in Damascus, right? What you need to have is a stable state where there is A, everyday security, B, rule of law, C, the provision of basic goods and consumables, and D, an expectation that your basic rights will be protected. Now, is that happening now in most of Syria? Absolutely not. And would the Assad regime be a contender to provide that level of state security again? I don't think it. I don't think it can. I think it's lost much of its legitimacy, and I think that it won't last for another, 5 or 10 years unless Iran seriously upgrades the kind of assistance it's giving it. But is there another contender within Syria? I don't see so. I don't see it at all. All the reports that we know coming out of Syria are that while Nusra and Daesh and other opposition groups do hold territory, there's a difference between holding territory and actually governing territory, providing water, providing electricity, providing health care, providing education, providing a basic level of public subsistence. And that's absent in most of Syria. Whether or not your titular leader in your community is a member of the Ba'ath Party and answers to Assad, or is a so-called militant for one of these groups. So I think the question is not so much about regime type or who leads, but rather how they lead and what kind of state is in place from a broader picture.
Thank you, Sean. Next question, please. Oh, did you want? Yes, please, of course.
Yeah, no, but separate questions. One is the Iran issue, and the other is what the answer is. I think, my conversation with the Iranians, they've been very transparent about this Assad thing. For them, yes, on the one hand, they're not wedded to Assad, and there are circumstances under which they would sort of jettison him, and perhaps a nuclear deal is one of those, although I'm not sure it is. But what they seem hung up on is what regime in Syria would guarantee their strategic interests in Lebanon. They can't imagine a scenario in which anybody else will do that as well as Assad did. Frankly, I think they're right. So yes, in principle, the solution has to involve Iran. Frankly, I really struggle to imagine how it could actually happen right now with this regime, with their geopolitical priorities. I don't think it can. The other is the question of how to get rid of Assad and then what?
And still combat ISIS.
And still combat
and
ISIS.
can it be combated unless
Of course, and address the question of what the refugees' real problem is. Yes, I agree with you. I mean, I'm not a humanitarian aid expert. I think the solution to it is the solution in Syria. But I'd like to sort of push back a bit on what you said about was there another contender and what happens. No, you're right. There isn't another contender. But I don't think the question of whether we push Assad out or help to do that or whatever, or whether he should be, is contingent on there being another contender at hand that we can immediately deploy into Syria. I think the question is there a political process in Syria that could lead to groups that hold enough popular support and have enough capability to run the country well?
Okay.
So I don't want to start with the question
All
of
right.
where's the contender.
We thank you. We're going to get our audience in here before we wrap up. Thank you ever so much. Yes, please, your question.
Yes, my name is Jacki Reich. I'm a professor of political science at Chestnut Hill College here in Philadelphia. And I wanted to get back to a point made earlier that Jordan is blessed by not being racked so much by sectarian tensions. But there is, of course, the tension between the Hashemite regime and the Palestinian majority segment of the population. And given all of these great pressures that we've been talking about this entire program with the Syrian refugee camp, I'm wondering, and also given that the United States, of course, by being a great backer of Jordan, implicitly is a great backer of King Abdullah and the Hashemite rule, I'm wondering if there's something the United States could do to reassure the Palestinian segment of the Jordanian population. And I wouldn't be surprised if the answer had to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. So.
Well, okay, before you answer your own question, maybe we'd ask Andrew Harper, could you hear that question? What more could the U.S. be doing to help with the basic economic situation in Jordan, if I understand you correctly? Jacki?
If you talk about the first part of the question, which was about what more can the US be doing to support Jordan, I think the US has been doing an incredible amount.
Yes, it has.
And I think we have to also pay due respect to what the US has done. I think where it's been lacking is possibly trying to effectively encourage the Gulf states to be doing more for Jordan, because there is a significant amount of money there, and also the Europeans as well. There's no doubt that the US on the bilateral support to Jordan, and also on the support to the refugees, has probably done more than everyone else combined in some aspects. So it's probably how do we galvanize other states to also really demonstrate international burden sharing.
So the U.S. could encourage third parties in the region to be more helpful and supportive.
Yeah, I think we just have to be realistic that the U.S. has also got its own pressures, and we can't just be going back to the U.S.
Dr. Abu-Rahman, you were nodding your head while the speakers were talking. You want to comment?
Yeah, but there are many points here. Let us begin with the final comments that we heard from professors in Philadelphia. Yes, I don't ignore that there is a tension in Jordan between the people, Jordanian people from Palestinian origins and East Jordanians, but we can't say that it is similar with the sectarian struggle. There are very big difference between what is happening in Iraq and Syria and what is going. We heard talk about particular problem which can dissolve easily by political reform, strong political reform. And we don't talk here about Palestinians, we talk about Jordanian citizens. They are from Palestinian origin. It's like any challenge, like in America, the Hispanic challenge, for example. Many people talk about this, so that we address here many problems here. We talk about justice, we talk about political rights, we talk about civil rights, so that it's not a huge issue like what is happening in Iraq and Syria. I admit that there is an internal problem, but I hope that we don't deal it with what is happening in the region. And it's not between the Hashemite regime and with the Palestinians. Or I think that there is no problem between the king and the Jordanians from Palestinian origin. Let's back go to the regional solution, about the solution of the refugees. I think the problem of the problem of the American approach, it's began with it's focused on the military solution, and the real solution is in the political process, not in the military solution. Maybe I disagree particularly with Dr. Sean when he mentioned that it's not a problem the type of the regime. And then in the end, he reached that the Assad, he couldn't offer the stability and couldn't offer the. So that I think it is the problem of the regime. You can't convince now the Syrian people that they can deal with Al-Assad. Is it related to the American-Iranian deal about the nuclear program? Yes, it is, because according to this situation, I don't think that there is what we call a military victory to any parts in Syria. So that we have, if we want to find out solution, we have to go to the political process. When you talk about political process, you have to share Iran and Russia and America. Can we reach a proposal to deal with? Geneva 1 failed, Geneva 2 failed. I think that we have to think in other way. To focus on the military and to fund the military campaign and to go through this, I think it's deepening the problem, not dissolving the problem. If you give hopes to people in Syria and Iraq, especially to the Sunni people, if you give guarantee to the Alawi people or to the Christians in Syria and Iraq, I think the roots of ISIS, the causes of ISIS, the ability of recruitment to ISIS will collapse in short time. So that there is the problem and there is the key of the solution.
Thank you, Dr. Abu-Rahman. Thank you. Back to you, Jacki.
Yes, we have a couple more questions I'd really like to get in here. Before we conclude from our audience, would you please step up to the microphone and give us your name and your question?
My name is Chris Lombardi. I'm a writer. I've spent a lot of time talking to former soldiers who served in Iraq who said they kind of saw this thing with Islamic State coming. And I wanted to know, actually, a lot of speakers have talked about in Jordan on TV, everyone could see the bombs being dropped by the Assad regime. But I want to know what is being seen about the bombs being dropped by the U.S., because we don't get any of that. We don't know at all exactly what's happening on the ground. And if you want to talk about not wanting to breed more radicalism, it's important to know what is actually being done.
Thank you. So reaction to what is seen then on Jordanian TV, I think we have to go to Jordan for that one, about U.S. strikes within Syria. We have touched on that a little bit about why now, why this. Anything further that anyone in that audience might like to add? Yusuf?
Any final thoughts? Go ahead.
My name is Rihan Fakhouri. I'm a reporter at the Rai newspaper. I've been covering the issue of refugees, and I've seen so many refugees in the camps and outside the camps. And I feel that people are getting despaired and they want to go back, even if they have to go with the Assad regime. So if this continues, more Syrians will go even if the war doesn't stop. That's how I see it.
Thank you. So some people are going back, even though that the situation has not ebbed, and because they're despairing. Do you have time for more comments?
There or here?
Here, in Jordan.
We have one more question. Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
We have one more question here then, in Philadelphia, and we can come back to you while you get ready. May I have your name and question, please, here in Philadelphia?
Yes, my name is Curtis Adams. I'm a history grad student at Temple University. My question is, what role does geopolitics play in both the continued escalation and suppression of the Syrian problem?
Well, I think geopolitics, again, we're going back to regional partners. Thank you. And we haven't spoken a lot about that. Sean, would you maybe like to address that?
Yeah, everything. Next question. No.
Regional partners as opposed to regional opponents.
Yeah, there are a lot of different regional lenses by which we can interpret what's happening in Syria now and the escalation of conflict there, in which everyone's losing and in which a purely military campaign is obviously not in the best interest for almost anyone involved, except for the U.S. and its regional partners. But geopolitics can play into the equation in one vital way, in looking at the way that the Syrian conflict has been portrayed as a broader sectarian clash. Now, most of us, including those of us who have lived or traveled or worked or studied in Jordan extensively, know that much of the sectarian discourse is completely constructed. There's no Shia threat in Jordan unless you count maybe a few dozen people who pass through every year. It's not as if Iran has territorial ambitions in Jordan, but the way that the Syrian conflict has been portrayed in an implicit way in the discourse of regional geopolitics between the Saudi government, the Qatari government, the Iranian government, the Egyptian government, the Jordanian government is one in which the U.S. is now seen as a major player on the side of certain predominantly Sunni Arab regimes like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and to a lesser extent Egypt, and trying to somehow stem the tide of the Assad regime from I think surviving too long. And the reason why the Syrian conflict has complicated this is that now, as we've all pointed out, the U.S. is implicitly helping the Syrian regime by bombing some of its most militant enemies, right? And at the same time, it doesn't want the Assad regime to be in there any longer. Our State Department has explicitly said the Assad regime is no longer the legitimate government of Syria, to which the Iranians say, no, it is until it's overthrown. So it's really impossible, in my view, to look at the Syrian conflict from a regional perspective without looking at all these crisscrossing alliances, I mean, that are binding regional partners together and are, I think, really they show how complex geopolitics can be, and ultimately how contradictory they can become, and most of all, how unproductive they are, especially when you look at the plight of the average Syrian refugee.
Thanks, Sean. Yusuf, I think we'd like to hear a little more from your audience before we go. We were looking at some young ladies who really looked like they were eager to ask you a question, so I guess I'm sticking up for them.
Yes,
I hope you
yes,
can
yes,
get
they are.
a question or
Yes,
two more.
go ahead, please.
Okay, my name is Marah Shawarbe. First, about schools. We have lots of children in the refugees. In the refugees. Yes, in the refugees, and the number exceeds. So the schools, the teachers in the school start doing 2 shifts, so the students can go to the schools. We need now efficient and effective solution. Secondly, in my opinion, the whole story started with people are fighting for more democracy and for their rights and fighting corruptions, and they lead fighting uncertainty, which is war. And thirdly, till when the Syrian regimes gonna face these problems in Jordan? Is there any solution for them?
Thank you. Okay. Anybody else? Hassan?
Anyone else? Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one question in the back. One gentleman in the back, he wants to comment. Can we pass the mic?
While we're waiting for him, just reminding our audience that in what the young lady was speaking about, that in some of the communities, many near the border, there are so many students now that there are 2 shifts, Syrian kids and Jordanian students.
Go ahead, Hassan.
My name is Hussam Rahayil. I'm with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation. One small comment is I beg the whole world to stop calling it the Islamic State, because it's not in any way Islam. It does not represent Islam. Islam is a religion of peace, a religion of respecting others, and this ISIS does not represent it.
Thank you. Thank you. Message well spoken. Okay. Can we pass the mic to the young lady in the front, please? Yeah.
My name is Siham Al-Alawni, student of University Yarmouk. My question is the Syrian crisis will take much more time, and how many impact will this crisis affect the Jordan economic? Thank you.
Okay. Our guests, would you like to respond to these, or?
Yeah, you asked us before we return back to be optimistic or little bit optimism, but I'm not sure. I was going
to ask you that later, but
I think that we are in the end of the. Okay, no problem. But the question.
You can be optimistic if you like.
Yeah, the question about the future, Dr. Yusuf, about the solution. Frankly, I'm not optimistic.
thank you. How perfect for the holiday season. No, in all honesty, I think we have looked at a lot of the trepidations, and Faisal Itani, Shanyam, thanks for being with us. Can you just leave us briefly with maybe some of the positives that might be gleaned from this, if possible?
There's, from where I stand, and I live in Washington, D.C., there is a great deal of, there are many circles within, of influence within the United States government that have a different idea of how to solve this problem than that's been carried out over the past, how long has it been? 3 years now. And those will be around, and that's a sort of institutionalized, established circle of thought. Whether or not they will be able to move policy in a different direction when there are political changes in America, I don't know the answer to that, but it's possible. So that's where my hope falls.
All right, thank you. Sean?
It's difficult to be optimistic about this administration's policies because so much of it seems to be a continuity of the last one. But I will say this, Jordan has faced repeated refugee crises from its west, bordering the West Bank and Palestine and Israel. It's faced refugee crises from the east, from Iraq. It's faced a refugee crisis from the north, from Syria. So it only has one more side to go. So hopefully the future will look a lot more stable. On a more serious note, I agree with my panelist. I think that people are in Washington and also in the UN and the Jordanian government and some other Arab governments that understand that a militaristic policy doesn't work in the long term. There are political and social and economic origins of extremism, and they differ from place to place and from context to context. And only by understanding the particular origins of that problem in Jordan, which certainly I think doesn't include bombing targets in Syria and killing other civilians, I think will we get to the bottom of this mess and stabilize and try to enact some modicum of national stability.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a fantastic discussion. And this concludes Jordan on the Frontline, an international town hall. Thank you. Shukran. Shukran. And we'd like to thank our partners at the Jordan Media Institute in Amman and my co-host, Yusuf Mansur. Shanyam of Temple University, Faisal Itani of the Atlantic Council. The producers of this hour are Mia Lobel and Rob Sachs. We thank our co-hosts, the Jordan Media Institute. Facilities in Jordan were provided by Jordan Media City. Also, thanks to WHYY-TV for providing live web streaming of this program, and to WHYY for hosting us. You can hear past programs by subscribing to our podcasts on iTunes. Find us on the TuneIn or Public Radio International apps, or visit our website, americaabroad.org. I'm Jacki Lyden. This is America Abroad from Public Radio International. Thank you. Support for this show was provided by the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art, the Henry Luce Foundation, and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.